the Christmas holiday latte mystery, a Miss Marple mystery. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple mystery. I'm Sam, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear a bit about you. What do you do? Or what did you do for a living? I always enjoy discovering more about our amazing community. Now, let's get cozy and start tonight's story. Chapter 1. A Village Wrapped in Snow. The first light of morning drifted gently across the rooftops of Little Bramble, softening the edges of the thatched cottages under a new layer of snow. The church bells rang out through the hush, their sound muffled as if wrapped in wool. Miss Marple stirred from her sleep, the familiar creak of the old guest bed answering the bells. She sat up slowly, adjusting her spectacles, and listened to the sound of footsteps crunching outside. Even in a sleepy village like this, gossip travelled faster than light on fresh snow. By the time she reached the window, the lane below was alive with quiet commotion. Mrs. Hardwick was sweeping her doorstep with unnecessary vigour, pausing every few strokes to lean toward her neighbour. Across the way, the baker's apprentice carried out warm loaves, his ears red from cold and curiosity. Everyone had a story to tell about what had happened. The night before at the Jolly Mug Cafe, Miss Marple could almost hear the swirl of rumour through the frosty air. Half-truths and embellishments, mixed like sugar and spice. She dressed carefully, wrapping her shawl tight, and made her way downstairs. The scent of pine from the decorated parlour mingled with the faint aroma of coffee her niece had left warming on the stove. Miss Marple poured herself a cup and took the first sip in silence. Tragic accident, the young constable had called it. A slip of fate. But Miss Marple had seen too many accidents that looked just a little too tidy. Outside, the village green shimmered beneath its snowy quilt. The old inn sign creaked faintly in the wind, and a robin hopped along the path as though nothing in the world had changed. Yet beneath the calm surface, Little Bramble hummed with unease. Word had it that poor Mr. Linton, respected accountant and faithful customer, had collapsed mid-latte just as the carolers passed by the window. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one ever did, Miss Marple thought wryly. She pulled on her gloves and stepped out into the crisp morning. The air smelled of smoke and cinnamon. At the gate, Mrs. Hardwick intercepted her at once, her face pink with excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? They say it was the milk. Maggie bought a new batch from that delivery lad who comes down from Bexton." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Never trust city milk, that's what I say." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Indeed, Mrs. Hardwick, though I've always found that milk alone seldom brings such drama to a cup of coffee." Mrs. Hardwick blinked, uncertain whether to agree or defend her theory. "Well," she said finally, "the constable's handling it." "Young man, very sure of himself?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, continuing on her way. And confidence is a fine thing, provided one also has experience. The constable in question, Constable Ridley, was standing by the cafe door, brushing snow from his hat and speaking importantly to anyone who paused long enough to listen. Miss Marple observed him from a distance before approaching. He was all good intentions and brisk energy, with the look of someone proud to wear a uniform in a quiet place. He spotted her and offered a polite nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple." Terrible business, that. Quite the fright for everyone, I'm sure. "Indeed," she said. "And how is poor Maggie?" "She's shaken naturally. We've told her not to blame herself. Everything points to natural causes, you see. Heart failure, likely enough." "Likely enough," Miss Marple echoed, her eyes flicking toward the frosted window where a single latte cup still sat abandoned behind the glass. "And yet, I find likelihoods are sometimes too comfortable to be true." Ridley looked puzzled for a moment, then gave a quick laugh. "You do have a way of putting things, Miss Marple, but I assure you there's no need for worry. Just a tragic coincidence." She smiled faintly. "I hope so, Constable. The village could use a quiet Christmas." As she walked on, her thoughts lingered on the scene inside that cafe, the steam from the cups, the faint smell of roasted beans, and the moment the laughter must have turned to horror. An accident, perhaps, but one with too many small details out of place. The cafe's bell had rung once more after the crowd dispersed. Someone had returned briefly when no one was looking. The idea settled uneasily in her mind, like a feather drifting against the grain. At the corner, Miss Marple paused to look back. Snowflakes were beginning to fall again, soft and slow, covering the cobblestones and the traces of last night's panic. The village appeared untouched, innocent as a postcard. But she had learned long ago that even the prettiest villages kept their shadows tucked neatly under the snow, and sometimes all it took was one small stir of curiosity to uncover them. By late morning, the snow had deepened into soft drifts along the village lanes, blanketing Little Bramble in quiet. Miss Marple, wrapped in her warm brown coat and sensible boots, walked slowly toward the Jolly Mug Cafe. Each step left a neat impression behind her, as though she were tracing a delicate line through time. The world seemed almost peaceful again, but Miss Marple knew how calm could deceive. It often did, especially when people most wanted to believe that everything was fine. The cafe stood at the corner of Market Street, its front window fogged with warmth and sorrow. Inside, Maggie Penrose moved stiffly between the tables, gathering cups that no one had touched since the night before. The usual glow of her smile was gone. Instead, she looked pale and small in her festive red apron, her hair escaping its neat bun. When she saw Miss Marple enter, her eyes filled with tears, she tried quickly to hide. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect company today," she said softly, wiping her hands on a cloth that trembled slightly. "It's kind of you to stop by, though I can't imagine what people must think." Miss Marple removed her gloves and smiled kindly. "People think many things, my dear. Most of them are wrong. I thought perhaps you could use a bit of friendly company and a fresh pair of eyes." Maggie let out a shaky breath and nodded toward the counter. "Please sit. The kettle's still hot, though I don't suppose anyone's much in the mood for coffee." Miss Marple chose a seat near the corner where she could see the entire room, the same table she'd sat at the previous evening. The scent of cinnamon and coffee beans still lingered, but beneath it was something faintly bitter, almost metallic. She said nothing for a moment, letting the room speak for itself. The chairs were slightly askew, the Christmas garland over the door, drooping where someone had brushed against it. Ordinary details, yes, but ordinary details could tell extraordinary truths if one looked closely enough. Maggie set a cup of tea before her and sat opposite, clasping her hands tightly. "I can't stop thinking about it," she whispered. He just fell forward. One moment he was smiling, and then, "Oh, Miss Marple, what if I did something wrong?" "You're a careful woman, Maggie," Miss Marple replied gently. "Your coffee is the pride of Little Bramble. If you'd done something wrong, it would be the first time." Maggie gave a weak smile, though it vanished as quickly as it came. "They'll never believe that." "Everyone's saying it was my milk, my syrups, something in my kitchen." Miss Marple sipped her tea and let her gaze wander toward the shelf behind the counter. Rows of labelled tins stood neatly side by side: nutmeg, cocoa, cinnamon, clove. Yet one small tin seemed slightly out of place, tilted as though hastily set down. Its lid bore a faint dusting of spice that had spilled across the polished wood. Miss Marple tilted her head. "You've kept things very tidy," she said softly. "Though I do notice your cinnamon's been busy." Maggie followed her gaze, frowning. "Oh, that? I must have knocked it over in the panic last night. I can't even remember. Everything happened so quickly." "I'm sure it did," Miss Marple murmured. "Panic does rather rearrange the world." She let her eyes drift toward the coffee grinder and the neat row of syrup bottles below. Most were half full, their sticky glass glinting in the light. But one stood apart, its label smudged, its cap wiped clean. And though the air smelled richly of spice, Miss Marple caught another note beneath it. Almond, faint, elusive, but unmistakable. It lingered like a whisper no one wanted to hear. She sat quietly for a moment longer, then turned back to Maggie. "Tell me, my dear, did Mr. Linton always take the same drink?" "Yes," Maggie said quickly. "A cinnamon latte, extra foam, just as he liked it. Habit can be comforting," Miss Marple said, her eyes soft but thoughtful. Though I sometimes think it makes us all a little predictable." Maggie's lip quivered. "You don't think someone meant to?" Miss Marple reached across and patted her hand. "I think that grief clouds judgment and fear does the rest. Let's leave conclusions to the constable for now. In the meantime, tidy your heart as neatly as your cafe." When she left the Jolly Mug, the snow had started again, tiny flakes swirling in the wind like stirred sugar. Miss Marple paused beneath the lamplight and looked back through the window at Maggie's bent figure. The scent of almonds still seemed to follow her, subtle and unsettling, as if the air itself were keeping a secret. Even comfort, Miss Marple thought, can be stirred the wrong way. Chapter 2. The Scent of Almonds. By the following morning, the storm had passed, leaving Little Bramble glittering beneath a pale blue sky. Icicles hung from the eaves like glass notes of a frozen melody, and chimney smoke curled upward in thin, lazy spirals. Yet the village itself felt restless. People found reasons to walk down Market Street who rarely left their hearths in winter, and each errand seemed to carry an extra stop at the post office. Where news always moved faster than the mail, Miss Marple entered just after 10, the small brass bell tinkling as she pushed the door open. The familiar scent of ink, paper, and peppermint lozenges drifted through the air. Behind the counter, Mrs. Pratt, the postmistress, looked up from her ledger with the expression of someone trying not to appear too eager. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her tone 1 part warmth and 2 parts curiosity. "A fine day for letters, though I dare say most folks are writing about that dreadful business." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "The human heart does seem fond of its mysteries. Mrs. Pratt, I suppose it gives us something to talk about when the weather does not." A small crowd lingered by the notice board. Mr. Cleeve, who ran the grocer's, old Mrs. Temple, with her knitting tucked into her handbag, and 2 young delivery lads who pretended to browse the holiday cards while clearly listening for fresh gossip. Their murmurs wove together like the ticking of clocks, low, insistent, and impossible to ignore. "They say Maggie's shut the cafe for good," Mrs. Temple whispered. "Can't face it after what happened." "Nonsense," replied Mr. Cleeve, shaking his head. "It wasn't her fault." Linton's heart gave out, simple as that. The man was under stress, everyone knows. "Money trouble, arguments with that boy of his." Miss Marple's ears pricked up at that, though she didn't interrupt. She had learned long ago that people spoke most freely when they thought no one important was listening. Mrs. Pratt leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "I heard from the vicar's wife that Edward Linton and his father had a dreadful row last week. Something about the will. Mr. Linton was planning to change it, or so they say." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, pretending to study a postcard of snow-covered cottages. "How interesting," she murmured. "Though family disagreements are rather like fires in winter, common and rarely fatal." "Except when they are," Mrs. Pratt said pointedly, then blushed at her own boldness. "Oh, forgive me, Miss Marple. It's just so awful, and poor Maggie. She doesn't deserve a shadow like this over Christmas." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She certainly does not." She paid for a small packet of stamps she did not need and stepped back into the crisp morning air. The square was quieter now, though every window seemed to hide a watching face. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery drifted toward her, warm and sweet, and yet underneath it she thought she caught something else, a faint echo of almonds, memory more than presence. It tugged at her thoughts as persistently as a whisper. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, her boots crunching softly in the snow. The quarrel between father and son had the unmistakable outline of motive. Money always did, especially when pride and disappointment shared the same house. She remembered Edward, tall, fair, a touch of arrogance about the eyes, the kind of young man who had known comfort all his life and yet resented the strings that came with it. His father, by contrast, had the tidy air of one who disliked waste, especially in people. As she reached the churchyard gate, she paused. The world around her was so peaceful, birds pecking at crumbs, the faint ring of a hammer from the blacksmith's shed, that it seemed almost absurd to imagine malice in it. And yet she knew better. Evil in the countryside seldom announced itself. It arrived wrapped in good manners and ordinary days. Sometimes it smelled faintly of almonds. She thought of Maggie again, alone in her quiet cafe, washing cups that no one would drink from. How quickly kindness turned into suspicion. The village that once adored her now whispered in corners, weighing sympathy against doubt. Miss Marple sighed softly. People meant well, but fear was a sharp spice. It altered the flavour of everything it touched. As she turned toward home, the breeze carried with it a trace of chimney smoke and the sweet tang of pine. Beneath those comforting scents, she fancied she could still detect that faint, bitter note. Poison, after all, often smells like innocence. The vicarage in Little Bramble always smelled faintly of beeswax and baked scones, a comforting blend that seemed to hold the building together better than mortar. That afternoon, the golden light of winter pooled across the carpet as Miss Marple stepped through the door, shaking snow from her coat. Mrs. Davenport, the vicar's cheerful wife, greeted her with both hands and a smile that could soften any day. "Oh, Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. You must be freezing." "Come, the fire's going and the tea's nearly ready," she said, ushering her into the sitting room. The scent of orange peel and cloves drifted from the teapot, filling the air with warmth. Miss Marple removed her gloves and settled into a comfortable chair by the hearth. "It's quite a delight to step into such coziness," she said. "One feels the vicarage could never permit unhappiness inside." Mrs. Davenport laughed. "Oh, don't be too sure. Between the choir's Christmas squabbles and the roof repairs, I sometimes think we could use divine intervention more than anyone." She poured tea into delicate china cups, adding a splash of milk with the ease of long practice. "And how are you managing in all this excitement?" "The village seems terribly on edge after poor Mr. Linton's passing." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Yes, tragic business. Everyone seems rather intent on finding a simple explanation. People don't like uncertainty," Mrs. Davenport said with a sigh. "It unsettles the digestion, you know." She handed Miss Marple a small plate of shortbread before continuing brightly, "Oh, that reminds me." You know Maggie from the cafe, of course. She's been such a dear thing, always bringing the vicar and me a little sample of whatever new concoction she's working on. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "New concoction?" "Yes. Her special syrup, she calls them," said Mrs. Davenport, leaning forward conspiratorially. "She's been experimenting with all sorts of flavours, spiced pear, winter almond, even something with rose petals. Apparently some of the villagers have been gifting her bottles of ingredients." "Isn't that kind?" "Very," Miss Marple said softly, though her mind had already begun to turn. "And these gifts came from whom, might you recall?" "Oh, anyone who fancied themselves a bit of a gourmet," Mrs. Davenport replied with a light laugh. Mrs. Pratt sent her homemade vanilla extract, and Mr. Cleeve gave her some cinnamon sticks from his shop. Edward Linton, I believe, brought her a bottle from London, something he said he'd found in a specialty store. She said it smelled heavenly, though I thought almond was an odd choice for coffee. Miss Marple's spoon paused mid-stir. "Almond, you say?" Mrs. Davenport didn't notice. "Yes, though Maggie told me it was more of a marzipan syrup. She said she only tried a little in the holiday drinks. I told her she ought to open a shop in Bath with her talent." "Such a clever girl." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts now quietly alert. "She does have a knack for detail. And these syrups? Did she ever mention keeping them separate from her usual stock?" "Oh, heavens, no. Maggie's kitchen is as tidy as her conscience. Everything on the same shelf, perfectly labelled. I once teased her that if she ran a chapel, even the hymnals would be alphabetized." Miss Marple chuckled softly. Fine quality in a cafe owner. "Though it does mean any little addition would blend quite unnoticed among the rest." Mrs. Davenport tilted her head. "You sound like you're thinking of something." "Only that people's kindness is a curious thing," Miss Marple said, setting down her cup. "Most gifts are meant in friendship, but sometimes, without realizing it, we hand each other burdens instead." Mrs. Davenport frowned, unsure if this was philosophy or concern. "You do have such a way of seeing things," she said fondly. "Would you like more tea?" "Thank you, my dear." "I've taken just enough to keep me warm," Miss Marple replied. Rising, she buttoned her coat and offered a smile. "It's been a lovely visit. I always leave your home with more food for thought than shortbread." As she stepped back into the cold air, the scent of cloves followed her briefly before fading into the crisp winter breeze. The village lay quiet beneath the falling dusk, the lamps just beginning to glow. Miss Marple walked slowly, her gloved hands folded before her, replaying Mrs. Davenport's words. Special syrups, almond, gifts from many hands. She had seen before how innocence could disguise itself in generosity, how something sweet could conceal something bitter. And as she turned down the lane toward the Jolly Mug's darkened window, she smiled to herself, gently, knowingly. Gifts like secrets are best unwrapped carefully. Chapter 3. The syrup bottles. The Jolly Mug was nearly empty by the time Miss Marple arrived that evening. Outside, the wind whispered through the alleyways, carrying faint traces of pine and chimney smoke. Inside, the cafe felt smaller than usual, its cheerful garlands drooping slightly with the weight of the long day. Maggie stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, her movements brisk but weary. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, sweetened faintly by something floral and unfamiliar. "Oh, Miss Marple, you shouldn't have come out in this weather," Maggie said with a tired smile. "It's been such a dreadful few days." "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple replied, unbuttoning her coat and laying it neatly across a chair. "A little tidying among friends is quite the best medicine after unpleasantness. Besides, I suspect you could use the company." Maggie hesitated before nodding. "You're right. It's been quiet since the constable finished his questions. Everyone's afraid to order their favourite drink as though the cinnamon lattes might hold a grudge." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "People's imaginations are quick to fill what facts leave empty. Let us give them something true to talk about instead. Your cafe, warm and spotless as always." They began together, the rhythm of cleaning soothing in its familiarity. Crockery clinked softly, and the broom whispered across the floorboards. Occasionally, the bell above the door tinkled as a gust of wind pressed against it. The world outside seemed wrapped in darkness, leaving the two women in a small pocket of lamplight and steam. When Miss Marple knelt to stack the last of the saucers beneath the counter, her fingers brushed against something cool. She drew back a little and peered closer. There, pushed behind the row of neatly arranged syrup bottles, stood one that didn't quite belong. Its glass caught the light differently, clearer, thinner, and the label looked as though it had been written in haste. "Oh, that one shouldn't be there," Maggie said quickly, noticing her glance. "I meant to throw it out, but I forgot. Someone gave it to me as a sample, I think." Miss Marple tilted the bottle gently, letting the amber liquid swirl within. "A sample, you say? How curious. The others are all labelled in your hand, very neat script, with those charming flourishes on the letters. But this one," she leaned closer. "It's not your writing, is it?" Maggie frowned and took the bottle, studying the uneven loops on the label. "No, it isn't. I thought perhaps Mr. Linton brought it when he came to order that special batch of holiday drinks. He was always fond of novelty things." "Did he now?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her gaze lingered on the bottle's cap, slightly tarnished, the seal uneven. "And you never used it?" Maggie hesitated. "I did once or twice. Just a dash in a latte or two before the fair. It smelled sweet, like almonds, but softer. I thought it was meant to be a festive touch." "Why do you ask?" "Only because I find that small details, when misplaced, tend to whisper stories of their own," Miss Marple replied. She replaced the bottle carefully on the counter, her gloved fingers steady. "Tell me, dear, where did you keep this one before?" "Oh, just under here," Maggie said, opening the small cupboard beside the till. "I keep odds and ends there, extra napkins, syrups that don't quite fit on the shelf." Miss Marple bent down to look. The shelf was tidy except for a faint ring of sticky residue, as though the bottle had leaked ever so slightly. The scent of almonds, faint but distinct, drifted up once more. "Strange," Miss Marple murmured. "Almonds are so lovely in marzipan, but quite out of place in coffee, wouldn't you say?" Maggie gave a nervous laugh. "Perhaps I was overzealous with my experiments." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes distant. "Or perhaps someone else was experimenting through you." Maggie turned toward her, startled. "You don't mean—" Miss Marple held up a hand gently. "No conclusions yet, my dear. merely observation. I've lived long enough to know that guilt can settle into the oddest corners, beneath counters, behind cheerful labels, even in the things we touch every day, without thinking. For a moment, the two women stood in silence, the cafe's lights humming softly overhead. Outside, the snow continued to fall, layering the village in a blanket of false peace. Miss Marple reached for her coat, her mind already sorting threads invisible to anyone else. The bottle gleamed faintly under the cafe lights, she thought, glancing back once more, as though hiding its own guilt. The next morning dawned pale and uncertain. The snow outside Little Bramble crisped into thin sheets of frost that glittered beneath a shy winter sun. The hush that followed was almost serene, but serenity rarely lasted long in villages such as these. By mid-morning, word had spread faster than any postman could carry it. The constable had received a call from London. Miss Marple was pouring herself a modest cup of tea when the church bells tolled faintly across the green. Moments later, her young neighbour, Elsie, knocked at the door, cheeks red, eyes wide with the thrill of fresh gossip. "Miss Marple, have you heard? Constable Briggs says the syrup from the Jolly Mug was tested in London." "Poison, they say." "Actual poison? Can you imagine?" Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate calm. "My dear, most things that surprise us tend to lose their sting once properly examined. Do come in before your nose freezes off." Elsie stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots, still brimming with half-formed details. "They said it was cyanide, just a trace, but enough to do harm." "Poor Mag, she's in pieces." "They've shut her cafe till further notice." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes clouded thoughtfully. "Cyanide, you say? How curious that something so dreadful should smell so innocent." By the time Miss Marple reached the Jolly Mug, a small crowd had gathered outside. The windows were dark, the door locked, and a notice pinned neatly beside it, "Closed, pending investigation." The village, which had so recently been fragrant with coffee and cinnamon, now murmured with fear and speculation. Constable Briggs stood near the lamp-post, his posture stiff, as if hoping his youth might look more like authority. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted her awkwardly, tugging his cap. "Best you keep clear for now. Orders from above." "They're taking it very seriously." "I should hope so," she said gently. "And poor Maggie?" "She's at home," Briggs replied, crying her eyes out. "They've suspended her trading license till things clear up." "I hate to see it, truly." "She wouldn't hurt a fly." "No," Miss Marple murmured, watching the frost gather along the cafe's doorstep. "But someone might, knowing she'd never be suspected." Briggs looked uncomfortable. "You think someone meant for this to happen?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that life in a small village rarely leaves room for pure coincidence." He frowned at that, but didn't argue. The wind rustled the paper notice, and for a moment both stood in silence. Later, Miss Marple found Maggie at her kitchen table, a handkerchief clutched tightly in one hand and a cold cup of tea in the other. The cosy room, usually scented with baking, now smelled faintly of lavender and grief. "I can't understand it, Miss Marple," Maggie said between quiet sobs. "It's as though someone's painted a monster's face over my own. They think I did it, carelessly or cruelly, and I can't convince them otherwise." Miss Marple reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over hers. "You don't need to convince everyone, my dear. Just one or two people who know where to look." Maggie shook her head. "But who would do such a thing? And why?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where a lone robin hopped along the sill. Sometimes the why hides in the everyday. A forgotten quarrel, a hurt pride, a bit of envy stirred in like sugar. It only takes one careless heart to start the rest tumbling. For a while they sat together in the hush of the kitchen. Outside, children's laughter echoed faintly from the green, a reminder that life continued even when trust faltered. When Miss Marple finally rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Keep your courage. These things have a way of settling, one truth at a time." As she stepped into the fading afternoon light, her mind turned over the puzzle: a mysterious bottle, a strange scent, a quarrel over inheritance, and a syrup that came from nowhere. In a small village, Miss Marple thought nothing is ever truly random. Chapter 4. Snowflakes and Secrets. By the following morning, Little Bramble had found its voice again. The quiet shock that had hung over the village like frost was beginning to thaw, replaced by the busy hum of speculation. If truth travels on foot, rumour, it seemed, had wings, and all of them beat most energetically inside the warm, flour-dusted walls of the village bakery. Miss Marple entered the crusty loaf just as the morning rush began. The scent of fresh bread mingled with cinnamon and chatter, the kind that rose and fell like waves. Behind the counter, Mrs. Penfold moved with the efficient grace of someone who could knead dough and trade gossip simultaneously. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said brightly, handing over a small loaf wrapped in paper. "Quite the excitement, isn't it? Poison in our very own cafe. Terrible thing, terrible." "Though between you and me, I'm not convinced it was an accident," Miss Marple offered a mild smile. "Aren't you? What makes you say so?" Mrs. Penfold leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, I heard from my cousin's friend who helps at the post office that Mr. Linton had words with Maggie just a week before he died. Something about that new cafe in the next village, the Silver Teacup, you know it? They say he was planning to invest there instead." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly, "and how curious that such plans find their way through so many mouths so quickly." Mrs. Penfold nodded sagely. "Oh, people talk, you know. Some say Maggie was jealous, others think it was that business about the inheritance. Mr. Linton's son hasn't been right since he came back from London. Not that I'd accuse anyone, of course." Miss Marple paid for her loaf and stepped aside to let others through. Behind her, the hum continued, names, suspicions, theories, each one a thread in a growing web. She lingered by the window, pretending to admire the snowfall as she listened. Old Mr. Pargeter, seated by the hearth with his morning bun, muttered, "Mark my words, it's always the quiet ones. That girl Maggie, too sweet by half. There's something behind those eyes." Across from him, Mrs. Dobbs, the postmistress, countered sharply, "Nonsense. She's a dear. I've always said the trouble came from outside. That Linton boy, never liked him. Walks about with city airs, thinking we're all beneath him." The arguments rolled on, harmless on the surface, yet heavy with the undercurrent of fear. In Little Bramble, suspicion didn't shout. It whispered politely behind teacups. Miss Marple found a seat by the window and unfolded her napkin with the same patience she reserved for unravelling lace. To the casual eye she appeared absorbed in her tea, but to those who knew her well, the stillness in her expression meant her mind was quietly knitting fragments together. What had Mr. Linton truly quarrelled about? What did Maggie not see in that mysterious syrup bottle? And who stood to gain the most from the disruption of her cafe's good name? She watched as young Timothy Briggs, the constable's nephew, entered the shop to collect a loaf for his uncle. His face was flushed with self-importance. "The inspector from London's coming tomorrow," he announced. "Said he'll have questions for everyone." "Even Mrs. Penfold, I bet." A ripple of excitement went through the room. Someone gasped. Someone else tisked dramatically. The idea of being questioned made the villagers both anxious and oddly flattered. Miss Marple smiled faintly into her cup. "So it begins," she murmured. For the rest of the morning, she let their stories swirl and twist like smoke, watching how each villager clung to what made them feel safest, some to outrage, others to pity, and a few to denial. Human nature, she reflected, was not so different from baking. The same ingredients, fear, pride, love, could rise or collapse depending on how gently one handled them. By the time she left, the snow had begun again, soft and relentless. Outside, the world looked clean and undisturbed, yet behind every shuttered window, tongues still wagged. Miss Marple tucked her loaf into her basket and smiled to herself. Rumours, she thought, are simply clues that have lost their manners. The snow had fallen steadily through the night, smoothing the village into a picture of calm perfection. By morning, Little Bramble looked as though it had been dusted with sugar. Roofs gleamed, trees glittered, and every sound felt softened, as if the world itself were whispering. Miss Marple, however, was not fooled by appearances. She had long ago learned that peace, like snow, can hide what lies beneath. She set out just after breakfast, her boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. The Jolly Mug stood closed and silent, its windows clouded with frost. A ribbon of sunlight touched the sign above the door, catching on a stray icicle. Everything looked still. Too still. Miss Marple paused, her breath forming little clouds before her. There, near the entrance, something caught her eye. Faint indentations in the fresh snow, not quite erased by the wind. She bent carefully, examining the marks. They weren't new, but neither were they from the day before. The layer of frost had only half filled them. The steps were narrow and deliberate, leading not toward the road as one might expect, but toward the side of the building. Curious, she followed. The cafe's side path curved gently past the window boxes, now buried under white drifts. At the corner, she found a patch where the snow had been disturbed. Small, oval depressions pressed deeply, as though someone had stood there a moment too long. Beyond that, the trail veered toward the garden gate. It wasn't far, yet the sight of those faint footprints sent a prickle of thought through her mind. Someone had come here after the last snowfall. Someone who had not wanted to be seen. Miss Marple lifted the latch and stepped into the narrow garden. The air smelled faintly of wet bark and the ghost of coffee grounds. In the far corner, half buried beneath a snow-covered shrub, glinted the edge of glass. She brushed the snow aside with her gloved hand and found not one, but 3 small syrup bottles lying in a cluster. 2 empty. One still held a few frozen drops of amber liquid. She crouched, her brow furrowed. "What on earth are you doing here?" The labels were partly peeled, faded by moisture, but she recognized the handwriting at once, the same uneven scrawl from the suspicious bottle behind the counter. The snow had preserved them like evidence sealed in ice. Just then, the quiet broke with the faint crunch of approaching steps. Miss Marple straightened slowly as Constable Briggs appeared at the corner, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Miss Marple," he called, startled. "I might have known I'd find you here before me. I assure you, my dear boy, I'm merely admiring the handiwork of nature," she said lightly. "Though it seems someone else was admiring it too, quite recently." Briggs frowned and followed her gaze. Those footprints could be the inspector or one of the lads checking for evidence. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps, though I fancy your lads don't wear shoes that small. Nor would they trouble to hide empty bottles beneath a bush." He blinked. "Bottles?" She gestured delicately toward the find. Briggs crouched, examining them, his breath fogging the air. "Well, I'll be. They look just like the ones from inside." "Indeed," she said softly. "But note the number. There were 5 varieties of syrup in the cafe's lineup, were there not? We now have 3 unaccounted for, and 1 peculiar bottle that appeared out of nowhere." Briggs scratched his head. "You think someone came back to get rid of them?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that whoever walked here believed the snow would cover their trail. But snow remembers what people forget." The constable looked uneasy, as though the still garden might whisper its own secrets. "I'll fetch the inspector," he said quickly. Miss Marple smiled faintly, watching him hurry away. Then she turned her gaze once more to the footprints, tracing their faint curve toward the gate. The pattern was deliberate, not hurried, the steps of someone confident enough to return to the scene of their own creation. She glanced at the bottles one last time, the frost glinting along their necks like thin silver collars. "Ah," she murmured, "you've been caught in your own chill, haven't you?" Then, gathering her scarf against the wind, she walked away, her mind quietly threading another line in the tapestry of truth forming beneath the snow. Chapter 5. A Family Affair. The Linton house sat at the far end of Little Bramble, an elegant remnant of gentler times. Its ivy-clad facade and shuttered windows spoke of respectability, but there was something in its stillness that felt uneasy, like a portrait hung slightly askew. Miss Marple approached the gate with her usual calm, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. a dusting of snow on the steps undisturbed except for one narrow path, a lamp left burning in an upstairs room long after dawn. Edward Linton opened the door himself. He looked older than his years, the kind of tired that comes from carrying too many unspoken things. "Miss Marple," he greeted politely, though his voice lacked warmth. "You're very kind to call. My father always spoke highly of you. I dare say he was a man of good opinions," Miss Marple replied gently. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," he said, ushering. "It's been a difficult few days." The drawing-room was a study in quiet decline. Heavy drapes blocked most of the winter light, and the fire in the grate had burned down to coals. On a side table stood a tray with a half-empty teapot and two mismatched cups. Miss Marple took in the faint scent of brandy lingering beneath the tea, an attempt at comfort that hadn't succeeded. Edward motioned for her to sit. "I suppose you've heard what they're saying," he said, forcing a brittle smile. "About my father, about that cafe girl." "I've heard many things," Miss Marple answered mildly, removing her gloves. "Most of them, I suspect, are only half true. I prefer to visit the other half in person." He let out a short, humourless laugh. "That sounds like you." Miss Marple watched him pour tea. His hands trembled slightly, and a few drops splashed onto the saucer. He didn't notice, but she did. "You mustn't think too much on the rumours," she said. "Villages run on them the way London runs on buses, constantly and never quite on time." Edward looked up, studying her face as if weighing how much he could trust her. "It's not just the rumours. There were business matters. My father wasn't well, but he wouldn't listen. He said I'd been reckless with the accounts. I told him it wasn't recklessness, it was investment, a chance to modernize. He called it foolishness." His voice dropped. We argued. That night, as it happens, Miss Marple inclined her head, neither surprised nor judgmental. Families do, I'm afraid. It's one of life's more reliable patterns. He gave a tight nod. "Yes, well, words were said." "Harsh ones. I left before he went to that cafe the next morning. I didn't see him again." He paused, staring into his cup as though something might surface there. "I thought I'd have time to make it right." Miss Marple allowed a silence, the kind that lets a truth settle without pressing it. "Time," she said softly, "is the one thing we all mistake for kindness." Edward looked up sharply, eyes shining with an emotion he quickly disguised. "You think the police will come for me next, don't you?" "I think," she said, folding her hands neatly, "that they will come for whomever the facts point toward. And facts, in my experience, rarely travel alone." He smiled faintly then, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "You make it sound almost comforting." "Comfort," Miss Marple replied, "is not the same as innocence." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window pane, scattering snowflakes against the glass. Edward flinched, his teacup trembling again. He held it too carefully, like a man afraid it might speak. Miss Marple rose to leave, her tone warm, but her gaze sharp. "You have your father's eyes," she said gently at the door. "I hope, for both your sakes, that you've not inherited his enemies as well." As she stepped back into the cold, the snow began to fall in soft, deliberate flakes, each one a quiet echo of something unsaid. The afternoon light slanted low through Miss Marple's parlour window, turning the lace curtains into pale veils of gold. On her writing desk sat a small notebook, its edges worn, its spine slightly bowed. She had fetched it from a drawer she rarely opened, where fragments of old correspondence and mementos waited like quiet witnesses to time. Miss Marple wasn't one for sentiment, but she did believe in patterns, and this one, she felt, was beginning to show its weave. Maggie's words from days ago lingered in her memory. "Mrs. Linton gave me that old recipe ledger when I first opened the cafe. Said it might bring me luck." Luck, Miss Marple mused, was often a word used when one meant influence. Pulling on her coat and scarf, she set off toward the Jolly Mug once more. The constable had lifted the cordon that morning, allowing Maggie to begin tidying under supervision. The cafe, though still subdued, carried the scent of cinnamon again, a sign that the world, despite scandal, insisted on turning. Maggie looked up from wiping a shelf, her face pale but steadier. "Miss Marple." You've heard then about the bottles? I have, my dear. And I've also been thinking about that old ledger Mrs. Linton gave you. Maggie blinked in surprise. Goodness, I'd forgotten all about it. It's in the back room somewhere, full of old handwriting and ink stains. I only used it when I first started for inspiration. Would you mind terribly if I had a look? Of course not. Maggie disappeared through the back door and returned with a thin, leather-bound book tied with string. Here, most of it's harmless. Ginger biscuits, orange cordial, that sort of thing. But some of the handwriting's hard to read. Miss Marple untied the string and turned a few pages. The scent of old paper rose faintly, mingled with sugar and cloves. Each page carried small stains of use, the kind of history that comes only from true kitchens. Yet one page stopped her short. Winter syrup blend. For coffee, cakes, or cordial. The recipe called for sugar, water, cinnamon, clove, and a curious ingredient marked only as almond essence. Mrs. L's Reserve. Mrs. L's Reserve, Miss Marple repeated aloud. Did she ever say what that was? Maggie shook her head. No, I just assumed it meant a special flavouring. She was very proud of her preserves and extracts. I even found a little bottle among her things when I first started experimenting. And that bottle, Miss Marple said gently, wouldn't happen to resemble the one we found behind your counter, would it? Maggie's eyes widened. Now that you mention it, yes. The handwriting was similar, but I didn't think it mattered. She'd given it to me herself. Miss Marple closed the book slowly, her mind turning over each new thread. Mrs. Linton, kind, charitable, respected, had always been the quiet sort of woman whose influence ran deeper than her voice. Yet, in the wake of Mr. Linton's passing, it was her name that now whispered through the pages of a forgotten recipe. Maggie, may I borrow this ledger for a day or two? Of course. Do you think it means something? I think, Miss Marple replied, slipping the string back around the cover, that every recipe has a secret ingredient. Sometimes it's motive. She left the cafe with the book tucked beneath her arm, snow crunching softly underfoot. The wind had begun to pick up again, sweeping curls of frost along the lane. In her mind, she saw the threads tightening, the quarrelling son, the grieving widow, the cafe girl caught in the middle, and the sweet scent of almonds binding them all. As she reached her cottage gate, she glanced back toward the distant chimney of the Jolly Mug, where a thin trail of smoke curled into the evening air. Yes, she murmured, motive often hides where generosity is too freely given. The village clock chimed 4, its sound clean and hollow in the cold. Miss Marple stepped inside, placed the ledger beside her lamp, and began to read again, slowly, methodically, as though every line might reveal not just a recipe, but a confession written in sugar and ink. Chapter 6. The Cafe at Midnight. The night had folded itself neatly over Little Bramble, blanketing every rooftop in silver frost. From her window, Miss Marple could see the faint shimmer of moonlight glancing off the cobblestones. The village slept, or so it seemed, but sleep eluded her. Thoughts, persistent, polite, and troublesome, wandered through her mind like parishioners after service, each one whispering about the same thing, the Jolly Mug. She put on her coat and a sensible pair of boots, lit her small lantern and stepped outside. The air was crisp, still, and faintly sweet with the scent of burning wood from distant hearths. In the hush of the late hour, even her steps seemed too loud. She took the long way round the green, past the vicarage and the shuttered bakery, where a lone cat slunk beneath a bench. As she approached the cafe, she slowed. The Jolly Mug stood quiet beneath a dusting of snow, its windows pale ovals of reflection. Yet one pane, the one near the counter, glowed faintly from within. Miss Marple's breath caught, frosting the air before her. Inside a figure moved. He was tall and lean, shoulders hunched, movements hurried but cautious. A shadow cast against the far wall, shifting with purpose. Even through the glass, Miss Marple could tell he wasn't a burglar. No, this was someone searching for something very specific. She moved closer, careful not to disturb the snow underfoot. From her angle, she could just make out his face as he turned toward the counter light. Edward Linton. Miss Marple's brows drew together in quiet thought. She had expected grief from the young man, perhaps guilt. But desperation, that was something new. Edward was rummaging through drawers, lifting ledgers, pulling at tins, peering into cupboards. He paused once, glancing toward the door, before resuming with the tense focus of a man who feared being caught more than he feared being cold. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadow of a lamp-post. The steady flicker of her lantern dimmed as she shielded it beneath her coat. She watched in silence, feeling the familiar pull of puzzle pieces sliding into place, though the picture was still incomplete. After several minutes, Edward found something small enough to fit in his coat pocket. He held it under the lamplight near the counter. Even from outside, Miss Marple saw the glint of glass. Another bottle. He hesitated, staring at it, his jaw tightening. Then, with a sharp motion, he tucked it away and turned toward the back exit instead of the front door. Miss Marple followed his movement with her eyes, noting the faint trace of footprints pressed into the snow as he disappeared behind the cafe. For a long moment she remained still. The wind brushed against her scarf, whispering around the eaves. He moved like a shadow trying to erase itself, she murmured softly, recalling her own youthful memories of such desperate acts, though none, she thought wryly, involved poison. She approached the window. Through the faint condensation she could see the disarray Edward had left behind. Drawers half open, a chair slightly askew, a spoon lying on the floor. Not carelessness, but haste, intent. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the counter, where the faint outline of a bottle's dust ring stood empty. He hadn't taken it all, then. Only what mattered. She turned back toward the lane, thoughtful. If Edward was searching, he must have known what to look for, and that meant he knew more than he had admitted, perhaps too much. As she walked home, the church clock struck 1. The sound carried over the rooftops, solemn and clean, like a toll for secrets. Miss Marple pulled her coat tighter and smiled faintly to herself. "In Little Bramble," she whispered, "even the dead don't sleep until the truth does." The snow began to fall again. Soft, deliberate flakes settling over the footprints she left behind. The next morning dawned softly, with snow melting into a pale mist that curled between chimneys and hedgerows. The village stirred slowly, its routine careful after the shock of recent days. Miss Marple arrived at the Jolly Mug just as Maggie was polishing cups behind the counter, her eyes rimmed red, but her spirit stubbornly intact. "Morning, Miss Marple," Maggie managed, her voice low. "Morning, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "Would you mind if I had a quiet word with Mr. Linton, should he appear? I believe he's rather fond of your coffee." Maggie gave a small nod, curiosity flickering behind her fatigue. She poured a cup for Miss Marple, who took her seat near the window, the same one from which she had watched shadows move the night before. Not 10 minutes later, Edward entered. His coat was damp at the edges, and his expression carried that unmistakable air of someone who hadn't slept. He froze slightly at the sight of Miss Marple, then forced a polite smile. "Morning," he said, moving toward the counter. "Do sit down, Mr. Linton," Miss Marple said kindly. "You look as though you could use a cup yourself." He hesitated, then joined her. Maggie, still unaware of the undercurrent, poured him coffee and retreated to the back room. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle clink of porcelain. "I often find," Miss Marple began, "that a night's walk clears the mind, though sometimes it reveals more than one intends." Edward stiffened. His spoon trembled faintly against the saucer. "You were out last night?" "I was," she said, her tone warm, not accusing. "I couldn't sleep. The snow was so lovely, so still. One might have thought the whole world had paused. Except, of course, for the light inside this very cafe." He looked down. "You saw me. I did. You seemed to be searching for something. Or perhaps hiding something?" She leaned forward slightly. "I'm quite good with both, you know." Edward's jaw worked as he tried to form words that wouldn't come. Finally he exhaled, his breath shaking. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way." Miss Marple waited. He rubbed a hand over his face, eyes glistening. "It was my father. He wouldn't stop controlling everything. The money, the estate, even my decisions. We argued that night. He called me useless, said he'd change his will. His voice cracked. I only wanted to scare him. I thought a touch in his drink, just enough to make him ill, might make him listen. And the bottle? Miss Marple asked quietly. I panicked, he said. When the constable came, when people started talking about poison in Maggie's cafe, I realized they'd trace it back somehow. So I brought one of the bottles here. I thought if it looked like it belonged to her, they'd stop looking at me. He looked at her then, eyes filled with regret. I never meant for anyone to drink it. Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment, her expression calm but sorrowful. Guilt, Mr. Linton, is a heavier cup to carry than any latte, she said softly, and it grows colder the longer one holds it. He nodded, tears gathering but unshed. What should I do? The right thing, she said simply. It may not lessen the burden, but it will make it honest. Edward buried his face in his hands. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing sunlight breaking across the rooftops. Maggie returned just as Miss Marple stood to leave, her expression unreadable. Take care of yourself, Mr. Linton, Miss Marple said, pausing at the door. Snow may melt, but footprints, you see, always leave their shape a while longer. Then she stepped into the morning air, the bell above the cafe door chiming gently, a quiet benediction for truth finally spoken aloud. Chapter 7. The Gift Exchange. The next morning, little Bramble woke beneath a sky washed clean. The snow had ceased at last, leaving soft drifts along the hedgerows that glittered under the early sun. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and for the first time in days, the air carried not fear, but quiet relief. Edward Linton walked alone toward the constable's office. His steps were measured, his shoulders squared against the cold. The village watched from behind curtains and open doors, whispering not with malice this time, but with something closer to pity. He had been the proud son of a proud man, and now he was just a figure fading into the pale morning light. Inside the jolly mug, Maggie stood at her counter again. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the chalkboard sign, wiping away the week's sad reminders. A few regulars drifted in, hesitant at first, then offering gentle smiles and small words of comfort. Mrs. Bellingham brought a tin of biscuits. The vicar's wife insisted on helping polish the teapots. Even the constable stopped by before escorting Edward, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Terrible business, he murmured to Maggie. But the truth's out now. That counts for something, she nodded, voice soft but steady. Yes, and I suppose forgiveness must start somewhere. Miss Marple, seated at her usual corner table, gave a faint smile at that. Her knitting lay forgotten beside a steaming cup of coffee. Cinnamon, not almond, and she'd made quite certain of that. The scent wound through the cafe like a gentle reminder that peace could return, even after bitterness had lingered too long. As Edward passed by the window, Miss Marple caught his eye. He paused, removing his gloves. For a moment, he looked no longer like a criminal, but a tired young man who had finally stopped running from his conscience. She inclined her head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement. He managed a small nod in return before turning away, the constable's boots crunching in rhythm beside his. Maggie approached Miss Marple's table and set down a fresh biscuit. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You've been so kind through all this. My dear, Miss Marple said, her voice low and soothing. Kindness is a village's truest defence, far more effective than suspicion, I've found. Maggie smiled faintly. I'll remember that. They sat together for a time, watching the sunlight spill across the floorboards. Outside, the children were already making snowmen, their laughter echoing down the lane. A pair of robins hopped along the fence, their tiny footprints marking the snow like delicate script. When the church bells began to ring noon, Miss Marple rose. I think, Maggie, she said, you should keep that cinnamon tin where it is. It seems to bring you luck. Maggie's laughter, soft and real, filled the cafe for the first time in days. I will, she said, and next time you come in, your coffee's on the house. Only if you promise not to make it too strong, Miss Marple replied, gathering her scarf. At my age, excitement should be taken in moderation. The door jingled softly as she stepped outside. The village stretched before her, white rooftops, curling smoke, the faint hum of ordinary life returning. Peace, like coffee, was best savoured warm, she thought, and in Little Bramble, warmth had at last returned. As she made her way home, the wind carried the faintest scent of cinnamon behind her, not a reminder of danger, but of renewal. And Miss Marple, wise as ever, knew that even the bitterest brew could give way to something sweet again. The evening settled softly over Little Bramble, the kind of hush that follows both snowfall and resolution. Lamps glowed behind lace curtains, and smoke rose in steady lines from tidy chimneys. Inside her cottage near the churchyard, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, a pot of tea steaming gently beside her. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth keeping the chill at bay. She selected a fresh sheet of paper and dipped her pen. Her handwriting neat and deliberate, "My dear Florence," she began. "You will forgive me, I hope, for not writing sooner. The last week has been most unusual, a curious mixture of sorrow and redemption, all within the confines of our dear neighbouring village of Little Bramble." Her words flowed easily, steady as her thoughts. "You would have liked it here. I think the cottages huddled close under the snow, the villagers bustling between gossip and goodwill. There is a cafe called the Jolly Mug, where cinnamon and comfort blend most admirably. It was there, alas, that the trouble began." She paused to sip her tea, smiling faintly as the clock on the mantel chimed 7. An unfortunate death, and as you might imagine, the first verdict was accidental. Yet I could not help noticing the faintest scent of almonds where only spice ought to linger. I have learned over the years that the smallest inconsistencies often whisper the loudest truths. Her pen scratched softly. The matter proved to be one of inheritance, a familiar folly, though never a less tragic one. The young man, Edward Linton, had been driven to a moment of dreadful weakness. Guilt, as ever, found its way to light, and he has now confessed. I find it remarkable, dear Florence, how greed can twist a heart, and yet how remorse can begin to uncoil it again. The fire popped, scattering a spark or two onto the grate. Miss Marple leaned back, thinking. I have often wondered, as you and I used to, whether evil in such places hides itself more cleverly for being wrapped in decency. Little Bramble is no different from St. Mary Mead. Its charm conceals its tempests, though I suppose that is true of any village, or indeed of any soul. She paused, pen hovering, before continuing more softly. Forgiveness, I have found, works much like snow. It covers the sharp edges, not to deny them, but to make the world a little gentler while it lasts. Maggie, the cafe owner, has reopened her doors, and today I had a most satisfactory cup of cinnamon coffee in peace. The villagers smiled again. Even the constable looked less burdened. It seems goodness can find its footing, even where guilt has walked before. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she signed off. Do come visit when the thaw begins. I promise you a quiet afternoon. No mysteries, only tea, a warm fire, and perhaps a slice of Victoria sponge. Though between you and me, I rather suspect that trouble follows curiosity wherever it goes, and you know I've never quite lost mine. She sealed the letter with her usual care and laid it beside the teapot. Outside, the village slept beneath a blanket of frost, the stars pricking through clear skies. Miss Marple looked out the window, her reflection meeting her gaze, wise, calm, endlessly curious, even in the quietest villages, she murmured. The human heart keeps its mysteries, and with that, she blew out the lamp, the last glow of the evening lingering softly around her, as if the story itself wished not quite to end. Chapter 8. A Toast to the Season. Christmas morning arrived with a hush so complete it felt as though the world had stopped to listen. The snow, now soft and shimmering, blanketed every rooftop and hedgerow in Little Bramble. Smoke rose from chimneys like ribbons, and the scent of pine and baking bread drifted lazily through the air. From the church steeple, bells rang clear and bright, their notes scattering across the village square like laughter. Inside the Jolly Mug, Maggie moved between tables, her face flushed from the heat of the oven and the joy of a new beginning. The cafe glowed with garlands and twinkling lights, a fir tree standing proudly in the corner. Each table held a small sprig of holly in a milk jug, and on the counter sat a tray of freshly baked mince pies dusted with sugar. The chatter of neighbours filled the air, cheerful, forgiving, and alive once more. Miss Marple arrived just as the first sunlight crept through the frosted windows, turning the room golden. She removed her gloves, smiling as Maggie hurried forward. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You're just in time for the first pour of the day." "Then I must count myself fortunate," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "The world always seems brighter after its first cup of coffee." Laughter rippled around the room as Maggie guided her to her favourite seat, the one near the window, where snowflakes sometimes clung to the glass before melting away. When the cups were filled and the chatter softened, Maggie appeared again, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with red string. "This is for you," she said, placing it before Miss Marple. "A small thank you for everything." Miss Marple looked surprised, then touched. She untied the string carefully, folding the paper as neatly as one might fold a memory. Inside was a mug, hand-painted, the glaze soft white with flecks of gold around the rim. Across the front, in elegant looping script, were 2 words. "Thank you, oh my dear," Miss Marple said quietly, tracing the letters with a finger. "It's far too lovely to drink from?" Maggie smiled, her eyes bright. "And perhaps it can hold flowers instead, or secrets, whichever you prefer." The villagers chuckled. Even the constable, standing shyly by the door with a pastry in hand, joined in. Someone began humming a carol, and soon the entire cafe was singing, softly at first, then with the kind of joy that fills a space from floor to ceiling. Outside, children pulled sleds through the snow while their parents watched from the windows. The church bells chimed again, slower this time, as though echoing the steady rhythm of peace settling over Little Bramble. When the song faded, Miss Marple raised her new mug slightly as if in toast. "To friendship," she said, her voice warm and clear. "And to lessons learned the gentle way." "To Miss Marple," someone called, and the cafe erupted in cheers. Maggie laughed through her tears. The morning stretched on, golden and bright, each moment settling like snow over the village's recent troubles. There were still small sorrows, as there always are. An empty chair here, a quiet memory there, but they no longer felt heavy. The air seemed to hum with forgiveness, and even the walls of the jolly mug seemed to sigh with relief. As the laughter rose again, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, watching the sunlight dance through her mug. Some gifts, she thought, are poured from the heart, and they warm more than any coffee ever could. The evening descended slowly over Little Bramble, folding the village in a hush of blue and silver. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, catching the glow of lanterns that lined the cobbled lanes. Each pool of light shimmered against the white, turning the path ahead into something softly enchanted. Miss Marple, wrapped in her wool coat and scarf, walked home at an unhurried pace, her steps leaving neat impressions that sparkled behind her. The laughter from the jolly mug still echoed faintly down the street, bright, human, and reassuring. It was the sound of life returning to its ordinary rhythm, of people mending the quiet bonds that had nearly unravelled. She paused at the corner by the churchyard, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys. In every window there was a flicker of movement, families at their suppers, friends lingering over tea, candles burning low. Miss Marple smiled to herself. "It's always the same," she murmured softly. "Even when trouble knocks, goodness finds its way back in." A cat darted across the lane, disappearing beneath a hedge. Somewhere nearby a gate creaked in the wind. The world had grown peaceful again. Not perfect, but calm, the way winter evenings sometimes are when forgiveness has done its quiet work. She reached the bridge at the edge of the green and rested her gloved hands on the railing. The stream below had frozen in patches, and the moonlight shimmered across it like glass. She thought of Edward Linton, his trembling confession, his father's sternness, the sadness of misjudged intentions. She thought, too, of Maggie, wiping the cafe tables clean, her laughter shy but genuine once more. "Poor boy," she whispered, her breath forming a soft cloud in the cold air. Guilt teaches harsh lessons, but sometimes it teaches the right ones. The church bells began to chime from behind her, a slow, rhythmic toll, each note carrying across the snow. She turned toward the sound, watching the steeple's silhouette against the indigo sky. It struck her that the village, for all its gossip and folly, was a living thing, one that faltered, stumbled, and yet always found its way to kindness again. As she walked on, the faint scent of cinnamon drifted from the jolly mug carried by the wind. It made her think of warmth, of second chances, of how fragile happiness could be, and how easily it returned once people stopped guarding their hearts. Near her gate, she paused again, looking back at the village bathed in snowlight. The lanterns shimmered like stars caught at street level, and the air glowed with quiet peace. She smiled, the kind of smile that begins in memory and ends in gratitude. "After all," she said softly to no one in particular, "mysteries end, but comfort lingers." With that, she pushed open her gate, its hinges creaking in familiar protest, and stepped into her garden. The frost made her roses glisten like silver lace. From inside her cottage came the faint ticking of the clock, the promise of tea, and the gentle warmth of home. Miss Marple took one last look at the snowy world before closing the door behind her. Outside, the wind stirred the lanterns, making their light dance across the snow, and little Bramble, its secrets finally laid to rest, drifted into the peaceful rhythm of another winter night. Thank you, dear listener, for joining Miss Marple in another cozy corner of curiosity and comfort. Perhaps you noticed the clues before she did, or perhaps you simply enjoyed the company, the warmth, and the gentle suspense of a Christmas mystery well told. Until next time, may your evenings be quiet, your cups full, and your heart open to wonder. After all, perhaps next time you'll join her for another cup and another secret.